Living on Mars sounds like humanity's greatest adventure. Red sunsets, crimson landscapes, a new world to call home. But there's a problem with Mars that no engineering solution can fix, no technology can overcome, no amount of human ingenuity can solve. It's not the radiation that will slowly cook your DNA. It's not the toxic soil that would poison your crops. It's not even the bone-crushing isolation of being 140 million miles from every person you've ever known. The problem is time itself. Mars will change you in ways that make returning to Earth impossible. Not just physically, though your bones will weaken and your heart will shrink. Not just psychologically, though the red horizon will rewire your brain. The problem is deeper, more permanent, more terrifying. After just 2 years on Mars, you would no longer be human in any way that matters, and the clock starts ticking the moment you arrive.
If you enjoy exploring the hidden realities of space exploration with us here, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us uncover more uncomfortable truths about our cosmic future.
What if everything we think we know about Mars colonization is missing the most crucial piece of the puzzle? We know Mars is dangerous, and everyone talks about the obvious threats that await any brave soul willing to make the journey to the Red Planet. Radiation bombardment from cosmic rays will slowly cook your DNA over time, while toxic soil laden with perchlorates will poison any crops you try to grow in the alien dirt beneath your feet. Bone-crushing isolation will test the limits of human sanity, as communication delays stretch from minutes to nearly half an hour each way, depending on where Earth and Mars sit in their eternal dance around the Sun. The psychological weight of being separated from every person you have ever known by 140 million miles of cold, empty space represents a burden unlike anything humans have faced in our entire evolutionary history. These challenges are real and they are formidable, but here is what makes this situation fascinating rather than hopeless. Brilliant minds across the globe are actively solving each one of these problems with remarkable ingenuity and determination. Engineers design underground habitats that use Martian regolith as natural radiation shielding, while closed-loop life support systems recycle every molecule of water and oxygen with stunning efficiency. Psychologists develop comprehensive protocols for maintaining crew mental health during extended isolation, while advanced communication systems minimize the impact of signal delays through sophisticated buffering and predictive algorithms. Agricultural specialists create hydroponic and aeroponic systems capable of producing nutritious food in sterile, controlled environments, free from toxic Martian soil contamination. Medical researchers work tirelessly on countermeasures for radiation exposure, using everything from pharmaceutical interventions to genetic therapies that could protect human cells from cosmic ray damage. Each technical challenge spawns entire industries devoted to finding elegant solutions, and the progress being made is nothing short of extraordinary. Space agencies publish detailed mission architectures showing exactly how humans will travel to Mars and establish permanent settlements within the next 2 decades. Private companies invest billions of dollars in developing the rockets and habitats and life support systems needed to make interplanetary civilization a reality, rather than science fiction. Universities graduate thousands of students each year, specializing in astrobiology and space medicine, and planetary engineering with the specific goal of enabling human survival on other worlds. The confidence is infectious, and the momentum feels unstoppable as we inch closer to achieving what once seemed impossible. However, there is something deeply troubling lurking beneath all this optimism and technical brilliance that nobody wants to discuss openly. All these magnificent solutions share a fundamental assumption that may not be true, and this assumption could invalidate everything we think we know about Mars colonization. Every habitat design, and every life support system, and every psychological protocol assumes that the human beings who arrive on Mars after an 18-month journey through deep space will be essentially the same human beings who left Earth nearly 2 years earlier. They assume that apart from some temporary deconditioning from prolonged weightlessness, and perhaps some psychological adjustment to their new environment, the colonists will remain fundamentally human in every biological and neurological sense that matters. Mission planners design return vehicles and rotation schedules based on the belief that after spending 2 or 3 years on the Martian surface, these pioneers will be able to come home and readjust to life on Earth, just like astronauts returning from the International Space Station. Medical teams prepare rehabilitation protocols that help returning Mars explorers regain their Earth strength and Earth balance, and Earth cardiovascular fitness, within a few months of touching down on their home planet. The entire enterprise rests on this assumption that human biology is robust enough and adaptable enough to handle a round trip to Mars without permanent changes to our fundamental physiology. But what if this assumption is wrong? What if the human body changes in ways that cannot be reversed once it adapts to the alien environment of Mars? What if the very act of living on another planet with different gravity and different atmospheric pressure and different radiation exposure triggers biological transformations that make returning to Earth not just difficult, but actually impossible? What if we are not planning a bold exploration mission, but rather creating the first permanent exiles in human history without even realizing what we're doing? The implications of this possibility are staggering, and yet almost no one in the space exploration community talks about it publicly, because the answer might force us to completely rethink everything we believe about becoming a multiplanetary species. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to have your DNA slowly unraveling while you sleep? Mars presents a radiation environment so hostile that simply existing on its surface exposes you to levels of cosmic bombardment that would be considered a medical emergency here on Earth. Unlike our planet, which enjoys the protective embrace of a powerful magnetic field that deflects most harmful particles from deep space, Mars stands naked and defenseless against the constant stream of high-energy cosmic rays that pepper its rusty landscape every single moment of every single day. These invisible bullets of destruction come from exploding stars and black holes and other violent cosmic phenomena scattered across our galaxy, and they carry enough energy to slice through human tissue like molecular scalpels, cutting DNA strands, and triggering cellular chaos that can take years or even decades to fully manifest. The numbers are genuinely terrifying when you examine them closely, because a round trip to Mars subjects each colonist to a minimum of 0.66 sieverts of ionizing radiation exposure, which might sound abstract, until you realize this is equivalent to receiving a full-body CT scan every few days for nearly 3 years straight. Imagine lying on that cold hospital table getting zapped with medical imaging radiation over and over again while doctors monitor your vital signs, and that gives you just a glimpse of what Mars colonists will endure as part of their daily existence on the red planet. The biological consequences of this relentless assault begin immediately at the cellular level, where cosmic rays smash into chromosomes and shatter genetic sequences that have been perfectly preserved for millions of years of human evolution. Cancer rates skyrocket as damaged cells begin reproducing uncontrollably, while immune system function deteriorates under the constant stress of repairing radiation damage throughout the body. Skin ages rapidly and becomes leathery and discolored, while internal organs struggle to maintain normal function as their cellular machinery gets progressively more damaged with each passing month on the Martian surface. Blood-forming tissues in bone marrow become particularly vulnerable to radiation effects, leading to anemia and increased infection risk, while reproductive cells suffer mutations that could affect not just the colonists themselves, but potentially their children and grandchildren for generations to come. The cardiovascular system weakens as radiation damages the delicate lining of blood vessels, leading to increased risks of heart attacks and strokes even in young, healthy individuals who started their Mars journey in peak physical condition. Neurological effects include memory problems and cognitive decline, as brain cells accumulate damage from years of cosmic ray exposure, while cataracts cloud vision and radiation-induced thyroid dysfunction disrupts hormonal balance throughout the body. Yet despite these sobering realities, the engineering community approaches radiation exposure as just another technical challenge, waiting for an elegant solution rather than an insurmountable barrier to human settlement. Underground habitats carved deep into Martian bedrock could provide natural shielding using the planet's own soil and rock as a barrier against cosmic rays, while advanced materials science develops new types of lightweight radiation, resistant composites for surface structures and spacesuits. Pharmaceutical companies work on developing radioprotective drugs that could boost the body's natural DNA repair mechanisms, while genetic engineering research explores ways to enhance human resistance to radiation damage at the cellular level. Electromagnetic shielding systems using powerful magnetic fields could theoretically deflect charged particles away from inhabited areas, while rotating habitat designs minimize exposure time for any individual surface activities. Medical monitoring systems track radiation doses in real time, allowing colonists to seek shelter during particularly intense cosmic ray storms, while advanced life support systems maintain safe environments inside pressurized habitats regardless of external conditions. Treatment protocols for radiation sickness become increasingly sophisticated as doctors learn to manage the long-term health effects of chronic low-level exposure, while regenerative medicine offers hope for repairing damaged tissues using stem cell therapies and other cutting-edge medical interventions. The consensus among mission planners remains optimistic because every aspect of the radiation problem appears solvable through some combination of better technology and smarter engineering and more advanced medical care. Challenging certainly and expensive without question, but ultimately just another obstacle that human ingenuity will overcome through careful planning and sufficient resources and unwavering determination to make life on Mars not just possible, but sustainable for generations of future colonists who will call the Red Planet home. What happens to the human psyche when every conversation with loved ones becomes a waiting game, measured in tens of minutes rather than milliseconds? The psychological isolation awaiting Mars colonists represents a form of sensory and social deprivation, unlike anything experienced in human history, because the fundamental nature of communication itself transforms from an interactive dialogue into something more resembling exchanged letters or voice recordings sent across an incomprehensible void. When Earth and Mars reach their closest approach during planetary alignment, the signal delay stretches to approximately 4 minutes each way, which means asking your spouse how their day went requires an 8-minute wait for any response, while during periods of superior conjunction, when the planets sit on opposite sides of the Sun, that delay can extend to nearly 24 minutes in each direction, making real-time conversation completely impossible. Imagine trying to maintain emotional intimacy with someone when every exchange of thoughts requires the patience of a chess match played by mail, and you begin to understand how profoundly this communication barrier will affect the mental health of Mars settlers who must watch helplessly as relationships with family members and friends slowly wither from the sheer impossibility of maintaining normal social bonds across interplanetary distances. The visual confirmation of this separation becomes even more psychologically devastating, because unlike astronauts on the International Space Station, who can gaze down at Earth and see the familiar blue marble suspended in space, Mars colonists will look up at the night sky and see their home planet as nothing more than a faint dot, barely distinguishable from countless other stars scattered across the cosmic backdrop. This represents the overview effect in reverse, where instead of gaining perspective on Earth's beauty and fragility by seeing it from space, the Mars colonists experience a profound sense of disconnection and abandonment as their entire world shrinks to an invisible speck lost among the constellations. The psychological weight of this visual reminder that everything they once knew exists in a place too distant to even see clearly with the naked eye creates a unique form of existential dread that no amount of training or preparation can fully address, because the human mind simply did not evolve to cope with such complete physical separation from the social environment that shaped our species. Research conducted during the Mars 500 experiment provides troubling insights into how extended isolation affects crew psychology, as 6 volunteers spent 520 days locked inside a cramped simulator in Moscow to replicate the psychological conditions of a Mars mission. And the results revealed a phenomenon that scientists call psychological autonomization, where crew members gradually withdraw from outside communication and begin forming an insular social unit that operates independently from mission control and external support networks. This autonomization process starts as a healthy adaptation that helps crew members bond with each other and develop the self-reliance necessary for survival in a hostile environment, but it can evolve into something more concerning as the isolated group develops its own culture and decision-making processes that may conflict with instructions or guidance from Earth-based mission controllers who lack the immediate context of daily life on Mars. The confined living conditions exacerbate these psychological challenges because Mars habitats will necessarily be cramped environments where privacy becomes a luxury and personal space shrinks to whatever small area each individual can claim as their own, while sharing kitchen facilities and recreational areas and sleeping quarters with the same small group of people for months or years without any possibility of escape or variety in social interaction. Repetitive daily routines designed to maximize survival and mission success can trigger severe depression and anxiety as colonists struggle with boredom and monotony, while interpersonal conflicts that might resolve quickly on Earth through separation or cooling off periods become festering sources of tension that threaten the cohesion and safety of the entire group. Sleep disorders become common as artificial lighting systems fail to properly replicate natural circadian rhythms, while the stress of constant life or death decision-making wears down psychological reserves and makes even minor disagreements feel like major crises. The psychological support systems being developed to address these challenges include extensive pre-mission training in conflict resolution and stress management, along with virtual reality technology that allows colonists to experience simulated environments from Earth, like walking through forests or relaxing on beaches, to provide temporary psychological relief from the alien landscape outside their habitat walls. Structured social activities and recreational programs help maintain crew morale, while regular communication schedules with Earth-based psychologists provide professional mental health support despite the communication delays, and carefully designed living spaces attempt to maximize privacy and personal comfort within the constraints of life support requirements and radiation shielding needs. How would it feel to step outside your front door and instantly suffocate while your blood boils and your skin freezes all at the same time? Mars presents an atmospheric cocktail so utterly alien to terrestrial life that simply breathing the ambient air would kill you within seconds, because the thin, wispy atmosphere consists of 95% carbon dioxide with only 0.2% oxygen, which means every breath you attempted to take would flood your lungs with a toxic gas mixture that provides no life-sustaining elements, while the atmospheric pressure sits at less than 1% of Earth's sea level, creating conditions where liquid water instantly vaporizes and human blood begins to bubble and boil inside your veins. The temperature swings on this frigid world defy comprehension, as daytime highs near the equator might reach a pleasant 70 degrees Fahrenheit during summer months, only to plummet to negative 100 degrees or colder when the sun disappears below the horizon, and the razor-thin atmosphere provides virtually no insulation to trap heat near the surface. These extreme thermal cycles create a constant expansion and contraction that tears apart any materials not specifically engineered to withstand such brutal conditions, while metal becomes brittle, and electronics fail, and even the most carefully designed equipment suffers mechanical stress that would be unimaginable in Earth's relatively stable climate. The notorious dust storms that periodically engulf the entire planet represent another category of environmental threat that goes far beyond mere inconvenience, because these tempests can rage for months at a time, blanketing everything in a fine abrasive powder that infiltrates sealed containers and clogs mechanical systems and reduces solar panel efficiency to nearly zero, while creating static electricity buildups that can damage sensitive electronic equipment. The dust particles themselves are incredibly fine and sharp-edged, like microscopic glass shards that penetrate every gap and crevice, while carrying electrostatic charges that make them cling to surfaces and resist removal even with powerful vacuum systems designed specifically for cleaning operations. When these global storms reach their peak intensity, they can block out so much sunlight that the entire planet experiences a kind of perpetual twilight that lasts for weeks, while surface temperatures drop even further and any solar-powered systems simply stop functioning until the storm finally subsides and the dust settles back to the ground in a fine coating that covers everything like volcanic ash. The soil composition presents yet another insidious threat, because Martian regolith contains high concentrations of perchlorate chemicals that are extremely toxic to human physiology and can cause thyroid dysfunction and kidney damage and other serious health problems even in relatively small doses, while these same chemicals make the soil completely unsuitable for growing food crops without extensive chemical treatment and purification processes. Perchlorates interfere with iodine uptake in the human body, which disrupts hormonal regulation and can lead to developmental problems and metabolic disorders, while prolonged exposure through skin contact or accidental ingestion creates cumulative health risks that worsen over time as these toxic compounds accumulate in body tissues. The fine dust that gets tracked into habitats on spacesuits and equipment carries these dangerous chemicals directly into living spaces where they can contaminate food supplies and water systems, despite the most careful decontamination procedures, because perchlorate particles are so small they can pass through many types of filtration systems. Yet the engineering community approaches each of these environmental challenges with unwavering optimism and technical confidence, because every aspect of Mars hostility appears to have a corresponding technological solution, waiting to be implemented through careful design and adequate funding and meticulous attention to redundancy and backup systems. Closed-loop life support systems recycle every molecule of breathable air while scrubbing carbon dioxide and regenerating oxygen through chemical processes and biological systems that operate continuously regardless of external atmospheric conditions. Advanced materials science develops new types of composites and alloys that can withstand extreme temperature cycling while maintaining structural integrity and flexibility needed for long-term operations in the harsh Martian environment. Dust mitigation technologies include electrostatic cleaning systems and specialized coatings that prevent particle adhesion, while habitat designs incorporate airlocks and filtration systems that minimize contamination of interior spaces. Soil remediation processes use chemical washing and biological treatment to remove perchlorate contamination, while hydroponic and aeroponic growing systems eliminate the need for direct contact with Martian regolith entirely. Backup power systems and energy storage technologies ensure continuous operation even during extended dust storms, while redundant life support components provide multiple layers of safety against equipment failure. The prevailing attitude among mission planners remains steadfastly optimistic, because each environmental challenge represents a well-defined engineering problem, with measurable parameters and testable solutions that can be developed and refined through iterative design processes and comprehensive testing programs here on Earth before any humans actually set foot on Mars. Could the very thing that makes Mars seem more accessible than other worlds actually be its most dangerous trap? Walking on the red planet initially feels like gaining superpowers, because Mars' gravity exerts only 38% of the force that shapes every movement on Earth, which means colonists can leap 3 times higher and carry loads that would be impossible to lift back home, while experiencing an almost magical lightness that makes even the most mundane tasks feel effortless and graceful. This reduced gravitational pull creates an intoxicating sense of physical freedom, where astronauts bounce across the landscape with kangaroo-like strides and lift heavy equipment with surprising ease, while their bodies adapt to this new reality, where weight becomes almost negligible and physical limitations seem to dissolve in the alien environment. The psychological boost from this enhanced physical capability provides a welcome respite from the stress and danger of living on a hostile world, because suddenly every colonist becomes temporarily superhuman, with enhanced jumping ability and lifting strength that makes construction work and exploration activities feel more like recreational sports than life-sustaining labor. However, this apparent advantage conceals a biological time bomb that begins ticking the moment human feet touch Martian soil, because the reduced gravitational load triggers a cascade of physiological changes that start as subtle adaptations but accelerate into irreversible transformations that threaten the long-term survival of any permanent settlement. Bone density begins deteriorating at an alarming rate as the skeletal system responds to decreased mechanical stress by reducing calcium deposition and increasing calcium resorption, which results in a net loss of 1 to 2% of total bone mass every month that colonists remain in the reduced gravity environment. This bone loss occurs most rapidly in weight-bearing structures like the spine and pelvis, and leg bones that evolved specifically to support body weight against Earth's full gravitational pull, but now find themselves underutilized and gradually weakening as osteoblast cells slow their bone-building activity, while osteoclast cells continue breaking down existing bone tissue at normal rates. The spine becomes particularly vulnerable as vertebral bodies lose density and structural integrity, while the natural curves that distribute load efficiently in Earth gravity begin to flatten and change shape in ways that create new stress patterns and potential injury risks during any return to higher gravity environments. Muscle tissue undergoes equally dramatic changes as the reduced workload against gravity causes rapid atrophy, particularly in the large postural muscles of the legs and back that maintain upright posture and enable walking and running activities on Earth, but become largely redundant in the low-gravity Martian environment. Research from extended microgravity exposure shows that astronauts can lose up to 20% of their muscle mass within just 1 month when gravitational loading decreases substantially, and while Mars gravity provides some resistance, it appears insufficient to maintain full muscle development and strength over extended periods. The cardiovascular system begins deconditioning as the heart no longer needs to pump blood against Earth's full gravitational gradient, which causes cardiac muscle to weaken and blood volume to decrease, while circulation patterns shift in ways that reduce overall cardiovascular fitness and endurance capacity. Blood pooling becomes less of an issue in reduced gravity, but this apparent benefit actually represents a dangerous adaptation because the cardiovascular system begins operating at lower baseline pressures and loses the ability to respond appropriately to gravitational stress if colonists ever attempt to return to Earth or encounter emergency situations requiring intense physical exertion. Exercise countermeasures that work reasonably well for astronauts on 6-month space station missions become inadequate for the extended exposure periods required for Mars colonization, because treadmill running and resistance training can slow but not prevent the fundamental biological adaptations to reduced gravity loading. The Advanced Resistive Exercise device used on the International Space Station helps maintain some muscle mass and bone density, but cannot fully replicate the complex loading patterns and constant gravitational stress that shaped human physiology over millions of years of evolution in Earth's one-gravity environment. Vibration platforms and other innovative exercise technologies show promise for enhancing the effectiveness of workout routines, but still fall short of providing the comprehensive physiological stimulation needed to maintain Earth-normal bone density and muscle mass during multi-year Mars missions. The most concerning aspect of these changes is their progressive nature, because unlike the acute effects of radiation exposure or psychological stress, the gravitational adaptations accumulate gradually and imperceptibly until colonists cross a threshold beyond which their bodies become fundamentally incompatible with Earth's gravitational environment, and returning home becomes not just difficult but potentially lethal. What if your body's greatest strength becomes its ultimate weakness when adaptation itself turns into a biological prison? The human organism possesses an extraordinary ability to adjust to new environments through complex physiological modifications that have enabled our species to survive in diverse climates and conditions across the globe, but this remarkable adaptability becomes a double-edged sword when applied to the alien environment of Mars, because every beneficial change that helps colonists survive on the red planet simultaneously makes them less capable of surviving anywhere else. The spinal column undergoes profound structural modifications as vertebrae gradually separate and increase their spacing, while the natural S-shaped curvature that efficiently distributes weight loads in Earth gravity begins to flatten and straighten in response to the reduced gravitational stress on the axial skeleton. These spinal adaptations initially feel beneficial because back pain decreases and posture becomes more relaxed, while the reduced compressive forces allow intervertebral discs to expand and herniation risks diminish dramatically compared to the constant pressure they experience under Earth's full gravitational load. However, these same changes create a spine that becomes structurally incompatible with Earth's gravitational environment, because the modified curvature and increased disc spacing cannot properly distribute the weight loads that would be encountered during any attempt to return home, where the suddenly increased gravitational force would compress the adapted spine in ways that could cause severe injury or permanent damage. The vestibular system inside the inner ear undergoes equally dramatic recalibration, as the otolith organs that detect gravitational acceleration and linear motion adjust their sensitivity thresholds to match the reduced gravitational input they receive on Mars, which initially improves balance and coordination in the low-gravity environment. The semicircular canals, responsible for detecting rotational motion, also adapt to the different fluid dynamics created by reduced gravitational effects on the endolymph that flows within these delicate structures, while the brain rewires its interpretation of vestibular signals to match the new gravitational reality. This neural plasticity represents one of the most remarkable features of human biology, but it creates a situation where the adapted vestibular system becomes hypersensitive to gravitational changes and would likely malfunction catastrophically if exposed to Earth's stronger gravitational field, leading to severe vertigo and disorientation that could persist for months or years. Muscle fiber composition transforms at the cellular level as slow-twitch fibers that maintain posture and provide endurance against gravitational loading begin to deteriorate and convert to fast-twitch fibers that are better suited for short bursts of activity in the low-gravity environment. This transformation initially enhances performance for activities like jumping and quick movements that are common in Mars exploration, but it fundamentally alters the muscular foundation that supports prolonged upright posture and walking activities that define normal human locomotion on Earth. The cellular machinery within muscle fibers adapts to the reduced workload by decreasing mitochondrial density and enzymatic activity, while sarcomere structure changes to optimize force production for the lighter loads encountered in Mars gravity. Bone tissue experiences the most dramatic cellular adaptations as osteoblast cells that build new bone matrix reduce their activity levels in response to decreased mechanical stress, while osteoclast cells that break down existing bone tissue continue operating at normal rates, creating an imbalance that leads to progressive bone loss and weakening. The cellular communication networks that normally coordinate bone remodeling become disrupted in reduced gravity as mechanosensitive pathways fail to receive the loading signals necessary to maintain proper bone formation rates. Calcium metabolism shifts as the body reduces intestinal absorption and increases urinary excretion of this essential mineral, while parathyroid hormone levels change to reflect the altered calcium balance throughout the skeletal system. The cardiovascular adaptations include changes in heart muscle fiber orientation and contractility, while blood vessel elasticity decreases and baroreceptor sensitivity diminishes as the circulatory system optimizes itself for pumping blood against reduced gravitational resistance. Red blood cell production decreases as the oxygen carrying demands diminish in the reduced activity environment, while plasma volume contracts and blood viscosity changes to match the altered hemodynamic requirements of life in low gravity. These adaptations create a perfectly optimized biological system for survival and performance on Mars, but they simultaneously create a human being who is fundamentally incompatible with life on Earth. Because every beneficial change that enhances Mars survival becomes a liability when exposed to Earth's gravitational environment. The adaptation paradox reveals itself as the body becomes increasingly specialized for its new environment, while losing the capacity to function in its original evolutionary context, creating a one-way biological transformation that traps colonists on Mars regardless of their desire to return home. Where exactly lies the invisible threshold beyond which a human being can never come home again? This question haunts mission planners who must design Mars expeditions without knowing the precise moment when biological adaptation crosses from reversible adjustment into permanent transformation, because our scientific understanding of long-term reduced gravity exposure remains frustratingly incomplete, despite decades of space medicine research. The longest continuous spaceflight in human history lasted 437 days when cosmonaut Valery Polyakov remained aboard the Russian space station Mir, and while his recovery provided valuable insights into the limits of human endurance in microgravity, his experience represents only a fraction of the time that Mars colonists will spend in altered gravitational environments. Current Mars mission architectures require approximately 18 months of travel through the weightlessness of deep space, followed by an extended surface stay of at least 18 months, during which colonists would experience the constant pull of Mars gravity at 38% of Earth normal, before embarking on another 18-month journey home through zero gravity once again. This timeline totals nearly 5 years of altered gravitational exposure, with the middle portion spent adapting specifically to Mars gravity, rather than the microgravity conditions studied aboard space stations, which means we have virtually no empirical data about how human physiology responds to multi-year exposure to partial gravity environments. The critical threshold question becomes even more urgent when we consider that most proposed Mars missions involve much longer surface stays, because the orbital mechanics of interplanetary travel create launch windows that occur only every 26 months, which means colonists might spend 3 to 5 years on the Martian surface before return opportunities become available. Animal studies using centrifuge systems to simulate various levels of reduced gravity provide our best current insights into the biological effects of partial gravity exposure, but these experiments reveal profoundly disturbing changes that occur much faster than anyone anticipated when mice and rats are subjected to Mars-level gravity for extended periods. Bone density loss accelerates dramatically, while muscle mass decreases at rates that suggest irreversible changes could begin within months, rather than years of exposure to reduced gravitational loading. The cellular mechanisms responsible for maintaining bone strength and muscle mass appear to have evolved specifically for Earth gravity conditions, and become increasingly dysfunctional as gravitational loading decreases below critical thresholds that may be higher than Mars gravity provides. Cardiovascular deconditioning proceeds more rapidly than expected, while vestibular adaptations show signs of permanent rewiring that could make readjustment to Earth gravity extremely difficult or impossible, after extended exposure periods. The most troubling aspect of these animal studies involves reproductive and developmental changes, because offspring born in reduced gravity environments show skeletal and muscular abnormalities that persist even when they are later exposed to normal gravitational conditions, suggesting that gravity exposure during critical developmental periods creates permanent structural changes that cannot be reversed through subsequent environmental modifications. Neurological adaptations also appear to be more persistent than initially expected, as the brain's motor control systems and spatial orientation mechanisms undergo fundamental rewiring to accommodate reduced gravity conditions, and these neural changes may be irreversible after extended exposure periods, particularly during critical developmental windows. The unanswered question that keeps space medicine researchers awake at night involves determining the exact point at which these beneficial adaptations transform from temporary adjustments into permanent biological modifications that make return to Earth physically impossible or life-threatening. Current medical monitoring protocols focus on tracking known markers of bone loss and muscle atrophy, but we lack comprehensive understanding of the cellular and molecular mechanisms that control the reversibility of gravitational adaptations over extended time periods. The development of reliable biomarkers that could predict when colonists approach the point of no return represents one of the most urgent research priorities in space medicine, because mission planners need this information to design appropriate rotation schedules and evacuation procedures for Mars settlements. However, the ethical implications of conducting the long-term human experiments necessary to answer these questions create an almost impossible research challenge, because deliberately exposing volunteers to potentially irreversible gravitational adaptations would violate basic principles of medical ethics and informed consent. The sobering reality is that we may only discover the true point of no return after the first Mars colonists have already crossed it, making them unwilling test subjects in the largest human physiology experiment ever conducted with their own bodies as the laboratory, and their ability to return home as the ultimate measure of success or failure. What happens when an entire species suddenly finds itself thrust into an alien world where the very forces that shaped its evolution no longer apply? Mars presents a unique evolutionary laboratory where human biology encounters environmental pressures that have never existed in our species' 4 million year journey from the African savanna to global dominance, because every aspect of the Martian environment creates selective pressures that favor genetic variations and physiological adaptations completely different from those that enabled our ancestors to thrive on Earth. The relentless bombardment of cosmic radiation becomes a constant mutagenic force that damages DNA strands and triggers random genetic changes at rates far exceeding anything experienced in Earth's magnetically protected biosphere, while simultaneously creating selection pressure for individuals with enhanced DNA repair mechanisms and radiation resistance that could manifest through naturally occurring genetic variants, or new mutations that arise during exposure. This radiation-induced mutagenesis operates like an accelerated evolution engine, where harmful mutations kill their carriers, while beneficial adaptations provide survival advantages that become increasingly important as generations pass and the cumulative effects of radiation exposure compound over time. Reproductive biology faces unprecedented challenges because pregnancy and fetal development have never occurred under reduced gravity conditions, which raises profound questions about how embryonic growth proceeds when the gravitational forces that normally guide cellular differentiation and organ formation are reduced to 38% of their evolutionary baseline. The delicate process of bone and muscle development during gestation relies heavily on gravitational loading to provide mechanical signals that trigger proper skeletal formation and muscular growth patterns. But these signals become dramatically altered in Mars, gravity potentially leading to offspring with fundamentally different body structures optimized for their low-gravity environment rather than the terrestrial conditions that shape their parents. Cardiovascular development during pregnancy also depends on gravitational gradients to establish proper circulation patterns and blood vessel formation, while neurological development requires specific gravitational inputs to calibrate the vestibular systems and motor control networks that enable normal movement and spatial orientation on Earth. Children born on Mars would experience their entire developmental trajectory under alien gravitational conditions that could fundamentally alter their skeletal proportions and muscle fiber composition and cardiovascular capacity and neurological wiring in ways that optimize them for survival in their Martian environment while simultaneously making them less capable of surviving in Earth's gravitational field. The metabolic adaptations required for long-term Mars survival involve comprehensive changes to cellular energy production and hormonal regulation, as the body adjusts to reduced oxygen availability and altered atmospheric pressure, and different radiation exposure levels that require modifications to fundamental biochemical pathways. Thyroid function changes to accommodate different metabolic demands, while adrenal hormone production shifts to manage the chronic stress of living in a hostile environment, and reproductive hormones adjust to the altered physiological conditions that affect fertility and sexual development. Cellular respiration efficiency improves to extract maximum energy from limited oxygen supplies, while mitochondrial density and enzymatic activity adapt to the unique metabolic challenges of Mars survival, including the need to repair radiation damage and maintain cellular function under reduced gravitational loading. These metabolic modifications provide survival advantages for Mars colonists, but they also represent departures from the normal human physiological baseline that could make readjustment to Earth conditions increasingly difficult as the adaptations become more pronounced over time. Natural selection begins operating immediately among Mars colonists because individuals with genetic variations that provide even small advantages in radiation resistance or bone density, retention, or cardiovascular efficiency or psychological resilience will have better survival rates and reproductive success compared to those without such beneficial traits. The harsh Martian environment amplifies the importance of minor genetic differences that might be insignificant on Earth, but become matters of life and death when survival margins are razor thin, and every physiological advantage can mean the difference between thriving and dying in the alien world. Over successive generations, these initially small genetic advantages compound through selective breeding and natural selection until the Mars population diverges significantly from Earth humans in ways that reflect adaptation to their unique environmental challenges. The isolation of Mars colonists from the terrestrial gene pool accelerates this evolutionary divergence because beneficial mutations that arise within the Mars population cannot be diluted through interbreeding with Earth humans, while harmful mutations that might be masked by genetic diversity on Earth become more pronounced in the smaller isolated population. Could the human form itself become so fundamentally altered that returning to our home planet would crush us under the weight of our own evolutionary heritage? Extended habitation on Mars triggers such comprehensive physiological modifications that the skeletal framework begins reshaping itself into a completely different architectural design, optimized for supporting body weight under reduced gravitational loading, rather than the robust Earth gravity structure that has defined human anatomy for millennia. The femur and tibia bones that currently serve as massive load-bearing pillars capable of supporting multiple times body weight during running and jumping activities gradually thin and elongate as the reduced gravitational stress signals bone-building cells to conserve calcium and minimize the metabolic expense of maintaining unnecessarily robust skeletal structures. Vertebral bodies compress and lose their characteristic wedge shape that creates the spinal curves necessary for efficient load distribution in Earth gravity, while the pelvis narrows and the rib cage expands to accommodate the fluid shifts and respiratory adaptations required for survival in Mars atmospheric conditions. These skeletal modifications initially provide advantages by reducing metabolic costs and improving mobility in the low-gravity environment, but they create a structural framework that becomes catastrophically inadequate for supporting body weight under Earth's full gravitational pull, where the modified bones would fracture and collapse under loads they were no longer designed to bear. The cardiac muscle undergoes equally dramatic remodeling, as the heart chambers shrink and wall thickness decreases in response to the reduced workload of pumping blood against diminished gravitational resistance, while stroke volume decreases and cardiac output adjusts to match the lower circulatory demands of reduced gravity physiology. Coronary arteries become smaller and less numerous as the heart muscle mass decreases and oxygen demands diminish, while the electrical conduction system that coordinates heartbeats adapts to the altered hemodynamic conditions by modifying timing intervals and rhythm patterns. These cardiovascular adaptations optimize circulation efficiency for Mars conditions, but they create a heart that lacks the pumping capacity and structural integrity needed to maintain adequate blood flow against Earth's gravitational gradient, where the weakened cardiac muscle would struggle to deliver sufficient oxygen and nutrients to vital organs particularly the brain, which requires consistent perfusion pressure to maintain consciousness and cognitive function. Pulmonary adaptations involve comprehensive restructuring of lung tissue architecture as alveolar density changes to maximize gas exchange efficiency in the thin Martian atmosphere, while respiratory muscle strength decreases due to reduced workload against the lower atmospheric pressure that requires less effort to inflate the lungs. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles that normally work against Earth's atmospheric pressure adapt to the reduced resistance by losing mass and contractile force, while breathing patterns shift to accommodate different oxygen partial pressures and carbon dioxide concentrations that characterize the artificial atmospheres maintained inside Mars habitats. Bronchial tree structure modifications improve airflow distribution in reduced pressure conditions, while surfactant production changes to maintain alveolar stability under different pressure gradients. But these same adaptations would create severe respiratory distress and potential lung collapse if suddenly exposed to Earth's higher atmospheric pressure and oxygen concentrations. Neurological rewiring represents perhaps the most profound and irreversible adaptation, as the brain's motor cortex and cerebellum undergo extensive plasticity to accommodate the dramatically different movement patterns and balance requirements of reduced gravity locomotion. The vestibular nuclei that process balance information recalibrate their sensitivity thresholds and response patterns, while the proprioceptive networks that provide spatial awareness of body position adapt to the altered sensory feedback created by reduced gravitational loading on joints and muscles. Motor learning pathways establish new coordination patterns for walking and reaching and grasping activities that optimize performance in low gravity. But these same neural adaptations would cause severe movement disorders and balance problems in Earth gravity, where the learned motor patterns become inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The timeline for these irreversible changes appears to accelerate beyond the 2 to 3 year mark, when multiple physiological systems reach adaptation thresholds that cannot be reversed through exercise or medical intervention, making return to Earth not merely difficult, but genuinely life-threatening, as the Mars-adapted body lacks the structural integrity and functional capacity needed to survive in its original gravitational environment. The cardiovascular system would fail to maintain adequate circulation, while the skeletal system would suffer multiple fractures, and the respiratory system would struggle to function properly, and the neurological system would create disorientation and movement disorders that could persist indefinitely even with intensive rehabilitation efforts. How does living under an alien sun gradually rewire the very essence of what makes you human at the deepest levels of consciousness and identity? The fundamental rhythm that governs all terrestrial life becomes disrupted on Mars because the planet rotates once every 24 hours and 39 minutes, creating a day-night cycle that gradually desynchronizes human circadian biology from the precise 24-hour pattern that has regulated sleep and hormone production and cellular metabolism for millions of years of evolutionary development. This seemingly minor time difference accumulates over weeks and months as colonists find their natural sleep-wake cycles drifting later each day, while melatonin production and cortisol rhythms struggle to match the alien solar pattern that provides the primary temporal cue for biological clock regulation. The suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain that serves as the master circadian pacemaker begins operating on Martian time rather than Earth time, which affects not just sleep quality, but also temperature regulation and immune function and cognitive performance as the entire endocrine system gradually shifts to match the new planetary rhythm. This chronobiological adaptation creates profound changes in consciousness because sleep patterns directly influence memory consolidation and emotional processing and decision-making capabilities, while the gradual drift away from Earth time creates a psychological disconnection from the temporal framework that connects colonists to their home planet and shared human experience. Sensory perception undergoes dramatic modifications as the visual system adapts to the unique spectral characteristics of sunlight filtered through Mars' thin atmosphere, which shifts the entire color palette toward red and orange wavelengths, while reducing the intensity and quality of illumination compared to the broad-spectrum solar radiation that shaped human vision on Earth. The retina gradually adjusts its sensitivity to optimize vision under these altered lighting conditions, while the visual cortex rewires its color processing networks to extract maximum information from the redshifted environment. but these same adaptations make normal Earth colours appear unnaturally blue and oversaturated when viewed through Mars-adapted eyes. Spatial awareness and depth perception change as the reduced atmospheric scattering and different horizon distances on Mars require the visual system to recalibrate its distance estimation algorithms, while the lower gravity affects proprioceptive feedback and vestibular processing, creating new spatial reference frames that optimize navigation and movement in the alien environment. The psychological impact of these sensory changes extends far beyond mere perception, because visual and spatial processing directly influence emotional responses and memory formation and social interaction patterns, as colonists begin experiencing their surroundings through fundamentally altered sensory frameworks that gradually separate their subjective experience from that of Earth-bound humans. Social bonding patterns undergo radical transformation as the extreme isolation and constant life-or-death dependence on small crew members creates hyper-intensive interpersonal relationships that bear little resemblance to normal human social structures developed in larger communities with escape routes and privacy options and external social networks. The psychological pressure of knowing that survival depends absolutely on maintaining group cohesion, while having no possibility of leaving or finding alternative social connections, creates unique bonding dynamics where conflicts become existential threats, and interpersonal harmony becomes literally a matter of life and death. These intense social pressures forge psychological connections that are simultaneously deeper and more fragile than typical human relationships, while the shared experience of isolation from Earth creates an us versus them mentality that gradually separates the Mars colonists from identification with terrestrial humanity. Communication delays, and the visual reminder that Earth appears as merely another star in the Martian sky, accelerate this psychological detachment as colonists begin thinking of themselves as Martians, rather than displaced Earthlings, while their emotional investment in Earth-based relationships and concerns gradually diminishes through lack of immediate relevance to daily survival needs. Cognitive processing patterns adapt to the resource scarcity and constant problem-solving demands of Mars survival by developing mental frameworks that prioritize efficiency and conservation and redundancy planning over the more exploratory and creative thinking patterns that characterize human cognition in resource-abundant Earth environments. The brain becomes increasingly focused on identifying potential failures and developing backup plans and optimizing resource utilization, while aesthetic appreciation and long-term planning and abstract thinking receive less neural resources as survival-focused cognitive patterns become dominant. This mental adaptation enhances Mars survival capabilities, but it also represents a fundamental shift away from the cognitive patterns that define human culture and creativity, and philosophical inquiry toward a more narrowly focused survival-oriented intelligence that may be incompatible with readjusting to Earth society, where such intense survival focus would be considered pathological. Identity transformation occurs gradually as colonists internalize their separation from Earth humanity, while developing new cultural norms and values and belief systems adapted to their unique circumstances, creating the psychological foundation for what could eventually become a distinct Martian civilization with its own social structures and worldview fundamentally different from terrestrial human culture. What kind of beings would emerge from wombs that have never known the pull of Earth gravity, or breathed air that was not manufactured by machines? The first children conceived and born on Mars would represent an unprecedented evolutionary leap because every aspect of their biological development would unfold under environmental conditions that have never existed in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth, creating organisms that share our genetic heritage but possess fundamentally different physiological capabilities and limitations. Embryonic development proceeds through carefully orchestrated stages that rely heavily on gravitational forces to guide cellular differentiation and tissue formation, as developing limb buds use mechanical stress signals to determine bone density and muscle attachment points, while the cardiovascular system requires gravitational gradients to establish proper circulation patterns and valve formation. In the reduced gravity environment of Mars, these developmental programs would unfold according to completely different physical parameters, creating offspring with elongated bone structures optimized for 38% gravitational loading, rather than the robust skeletal architecture that characterizes Earth-adapted humans. The spine would develop different curvature patterns and vertebral spacing, while the pelvis and ribcage would assume proportions that optimize respiratory efficiency and movement patterns for low-gravity locomotion, creating body plans that appear almost alien when compared to terrestrial human anatomy. Muscle fiber development would proceed along pathways that prioritize fast-twitch fibers for explosive movements, rather than the slow-twitch endurance fibers needed for sustained upright posture against Earth gravity, while tendon and ligament structures would form with reduced tensile strength, appropriate for the lighter loads they would encounter throughout their lives. Brain development represents perhaps the most profound departure from Earth-normal human neurology, because the neural networks responsible for motor control and spatial orientation and balance would wire themselves according to the gravitational and environmental conditions present during critical developmental windows when synaptic connections form and pruning occurs. The vestibular system would calibrate itself to Mars gravity levels, while the cerebellum would develop motor learning algorithms optimized for low-gravity movement patterns, and the visual cortex would adapt to process the red-shifted light spectrum and atmospheric conditions that characterize the Martian environment. These neurological adaptations would create cognitive capabilities and perceptual frameworks fundamentally different from those of Earth humans, while simultaneously making normal Earth environments feel alien and disorienting to Mars-born individuals. Immune system development in the sterile artificial environments of Mars habitats would follow radically different trajectories because the developing immune system relies on exposure to diverse microorganisms during infancy and childhood to calibrate appropriate responses to pathogens and foreign substances. Mars-born children would develop in environments where microbial diversity is strictly controlled and limited to beneficial organisms necessary for life support systems, while exposure to cosmic radiation creates chronic inflammatory responses that could alter immune cell development and function in unpredictable ways. The lack of natural microbial exposure could result in immune systems that are simultaneously hypersensitive to novel microorganisms and less capable of distinguishing between harmful pathogens, and beneficial bacteria, creating vulnerability to infections that would be minor illnesses for Earth-adapted immune systems. Genetic expression patterns would shift dramatically through epigenetic modifications that respond to the unique environmental stresses of Mars, including radiation exposure and atmospheric composition, and gravitational loading, while these epigenetic changes could be passed to subsequent generations, creating heritable adaptations that accumulate over time. Hormonal development would proceed under different regulatory frameworks, as endocrine systems adapt to the altered physiological demands of Mars survival, including modified growth hormone production and thyroid function, and reproductive hormone cycles that reflect the unique metabolic and developmental requirements of low-gravity existence. The ethical implications of creating humans who are biologically incapable of surviving on their species' homeworld raise profound moral questions about parental consent and reproductive rights, because Mars-born individuals would be permanent exiles from Earth regardless of their personal desires or circumstances. These children would possess no choice in their biological destiny, because their parents made reproduction decisions that condemned their offspring to life on a single planet, where survival depends entirely on maintaining artificial life support systems and technological infrastructure that could fail catastrophically. The psychological burden of knowing that an entire world exists where their genetic relatives live and thrive, but which remains forever inaccessible due to biological incompatibility, could create unique forms of existential distress and identity confusion that have no precedent in human psychology. Furthermore, the reproductive isolation of Mars-born humans from Earth populations would accelerate genetic divergence through founder effects and genetic drift, while natural selection pressures specific to Mars would drive rapid evolutionary changes that could result in reproductive incompatibility with Earth humans within relatively few generations, creating two distinct human species separated not just by distance, but by fundamental biological differences. Could humanity split into two distinct species within the span of just a few centuries as evolutionary pressures sculpt Mars colonists into beings so different from their Earth ancestors that interbreeding becomes biologically impossible? The isolated population of Mars settlers would experience accelerated evolutionary changes, driven by intense environmental selection pressures that favor specific genetic variants while eliminating others at rates far exceeding the gradual pace of natural selection that shaped terrestrial human evolution over hundreds of thousands of years. Physical characteristics would diverge rapidly, the successive generations adapt to the unique demands of low-gravity existence, with each new cohort displaying more pronounced skeletal elongation and reduced bone density optimized for supporting body weight under Mars gravitational conditions. The femur and humerus bones would gradually lengthen while maintaining proportionally thinner cortical walls, creating individuals with distinctly taller and more slender builds compared to their Earth counterparts, while pelvic structure would narrow and ribcage proportions would shift to accommodate respiratory adaptations needed for extracting oxygen from thin artificial atmospheres. Lung capacity would increase substantially through both developmental adaptations and evolutionary selection, as individuals with naturally larger respiratory systems gain significant survival advantages in the oxygen-poor environments that characterize Mars habitation modules, while alveolar density and respiratory muscle strength would enhance gas exchange efficiency beyond normal human parameters. Cardiovascular modifications would produce hearts with altered chamber geometries and enhanced stroke volumes, capable of maintaining circulation against reduced gravitational gradients, while blood vessel elasticity and baroreceptor sensitivity would adapt to the hemodynamic requirements of low-gravity physiology, creating circulatory systems optimized for Mars atmospheric conditions. Dermatological evolution would manifest through increased melanin production, as cosmic radiation exposure creates overwhelming selection pressure, favoring individuals with enhanced natural protection against DNA-damaging cosmic rays, while skin thickness and cellular repair mechanisms would adapt to chronic radiation exposure levels that would be lethal to unprotected Earth humans. Pigmentation changes might extend beyond simple darkening to include completely novel skin colorations, as melanin chemistry adapts to specific radiation wavelengths encountered on Mars, while subcutaneous fat distribution would shift to provide additional radiation shielding for vital organs and reproductive tissues. Hair follicle density and keratin composition would modify to minimize radiation penetration, while sebaceous gland activity would adjust to maintain skin integrity under different atmospheric humidity and pressure conditions that characterize pressurized Mars habitats. Reproductive isolation would develop through multiple biological mechanisms as pelvic dimensions and reproductive organ proportions adapt to low-gravity conditions, while hormonal cycles and fertility patterns adjust to the unique metabolic and environmental stresses of Mars existence. Genetic compatibility would gradually diminish as chromosomal arrangements and gene expression patterns diverge through accumulating mutations and epigenetic modifications that become fixed in the Mars population while remaining absent from Earth gene pools. Sperm and egg cell physiology would adapt to function optimally under Mars conditions, while potentially becoming less viable when attempting fertilization with Earth human gametes, creating biochemical barriers to successful reproduction between the two populations. Neurological evolution would produce cognitive capabilities specifically adapted to Mars survival requirements, with enhanced spatial reasoning abilities that optimize navigation and resource management in three-dimensional low-gravity environments, while memory consolidation patterns would shift to prioritize information retention relevant to technical problem-solving and equipment maintenance. Social behavior patterns would diverge as group dynamics optimize for small isolated communities where cooperation and conflict resolution become matters of species survival, while individual personality traits that enhance group cohesion would be strongly selected for, while antisocial tendencies would be rapidly eliminated from the gene pool. Communication patterns might evolve specialized vocabularies and linguistic structures that reflect the unique technological and environmental challenges of Mars existence, while emotional processing and stress response mechanisms would adapt to the chronic psychological pressures of living in artificial environments where equipment failure could mean death. The timeline for reproductive speciation could accelerate dramatically under the intense selection pressures of Mars colonization, with estimates suggesting that reproductive isolation could develop within 10 to 20 generations as beneficial genetic variants become fixed in the Mars population, while harmful alleles are rapidly eliminated through natural selection, operating at unprecedented intensity. Founder effects would amplify genetic drift in the small initial population, while novel mutations arising from radiation exposure would provide raw material for rapid evolutionary change, while the complete geographic isolation of Mars ensures that gene flow between Earth and Mars populations ceases entirely once initial colonization waves conclude, creating conditions ideal for allopatric speciation events. What happens when the singular story of humanity fractures into two parallel narratives that can never again converge? The emergence of distinct Martian and terrestrial civilizations represents more than simple geographic separation, because the fundamental conditions of existence on each world would drive cultural evolution along completely different trajectories, creating value systems and social structures so divergent that meaningful communication between the societies becomes increasingly difficult despite shared linguistic origins. Martian culture would develop around principles of extreme resource conservation and technological dependence, where every decision carries life or death consequences, and wastefulness becomes not merely inefficient but literally murderous to fellow colonists who depend on shared resources for survival. This scarcity-driven mentality would permeate every aspect of social interaction, from romantic relationships that must consider genetic diversity and reproductive efficiency to artistic expression that focuses on functional beauty rather than pure aesthetics, while religious and philosophical frameworks would center on humanity's relationship with hostile nature rather than the abundance-based spiritual traditions that flourished on resource-rich Earth. Language evolution would accelerate as Martian dialects develop specialized technical vocabularies for equipment maintenance and environmental monitoring, while communication patterns adapt to the social pressures of small isolated communities where indirect confrontation and conflict avoidance become essential survival skills. Economic systems would evolve along completely different principles, as traditional concepts of ownership and property become meaningless in environments where individual survival depends absolutely on collective resource management and technological infrastructure maintenance, while wealth accumulation becomes impossible and potentially counterproductive when every material possession represents weight and space that could be allocated to life-supporting equipment instead. Martian economics would likely operate on principles of strict resource allocation and contribution-based distribution, where social status derives from technical competence and community contribution rather than material accumulation, while innovation and problem-solving abilities would become the primary determinants of individual success and reproductive opportunities. Trade relationships with Earth would become increasingly asymmetrical as Mars develops unique technologies and materials optimized for low-gravity, high-radiation environments that have little application on Earth, while terrestrial products become prohibitively expensive to transport across interplanetary distances, creating complete economic independence, whether desired or not. Political structures would diverge radically as communication delays make real-time consultation with Earth-based authorities completely impractical for addressing urgent situations that require immediate decisions, while the technical complexity of Mars survival would favour technocratic governance where scientific expertise and engineering competence become more important qualifications for leadership than democratic popularity or charismatic appeal. Martian political systems would likely develop around consensus-building mechanisms designed to maintain group cohesion, while incorporating dispute resolution protocols that prevent conflicts from escalating to violence, where any disruption of social harmony could threaten community survival. The inability to rely on Earth-based military or police support would necessitate internal security arrangements based on social pressure and ostracism rather than external enforcement, while legal frameworks would evolve to address unique crimes like resource hoarding or equipment sabotage that have no terrestrial equivalents. Historical precedents suggest that isolated human populations invariably develop mutual suspicion and hostility toward their parent civilizations as cultural differences accumulate and resource competition intensifies, while communication barriers create misunderstandings that escalate into lasting grievances. The relationship between Martian and terrestrial humans could follow similar patterns as economic interests diverge and cultural values become incompatible, while each society develops narratives that justify their superiority over the other group. Mars colonists might develop superiority complexes based on their technological sophistication and survival capabilities, while Earth humans could view Martians as aberrant mutations who abandon their humanity for artificial existence on a dead world. These psychological divisions would be amplified by the biological divergence occurring simultaneously as physical differences become more pronounced and reproductive compatibility decreases, making the two populations increasingly separate species rather than geographic variants of the same organism. The irreversible nature of this separation stems from the fundamental impossibility of undoing biological adaptations once they become fixed in isolated gene pools, while cultural divergence creates identity frameworks that resist reunification, even if technological solutions could somehow overcome the physical barriers to reintegration. Once Martian society achieves political and economic independence, while developing distinct biological characteristics, the split becomes permanent, regardless of future technological developments or changing political circumstances, because the two populations would have become fundamentally incompatible in terms of biology and culture and social organization, creating a branching point in human evolution that could never be reversed through any conceivable intervention. Why does the same human ingenuity that solved radiation shielding and atmospheric processing fail completely when confronted with the inexorable biological clock that transforms colonists into permanent Martian exiles? The fundamental difference between technological challenges and evolutionary adaptations lies in the fact that engineering solutions can overcome external environmental threats through clever design and sufficient resources, while biological transformation occurs at the cellular and genetic level according to evolutionary imperatives that cannot be bypassed through technological intervention, no matter how sophisticated or expensive the attempted countermeasures become. Artificial gravity systems represent the most obvious potential solution, but creating Earth-normal gravitational environments on Mars requires massive rotating structures with diameters measured in kilometers rather than meters, because the physics of centrifugal force demand enormous rotational radii to generate one gravity acceleration without creating disorienting Coriolis effects that would make normal movement impossible. The engineering challenges of constructing such gigantic rotating habitats exceed current technological capabilities by orders of magnitude, while the energy requirements for maintaining continuous rotation would consume resources far beyond what any Mars colony could reasonably allocate, while structural stresses on materials operating under constant centrifugal loading would require advances in material science that may never become practical or economically viable. Even if artificial gravity systems could be built and maintained, they would need to operate continuously for decades without failure, because any interruption in gravitational loading would restart the adaptation process, while the psychological effects of living inside constantly rotating environments could create new health problems, including motion sickness and spatial disorientation that might be worse than the gravitational adaptation they are designed to prevent. Pharmaceutical interventions show promise for slowing specific aspects of gravitational adaptation, but they cannot prevent the fundamental biological responses that occur when human physiology encounters environmental conditions that differ dramatically from the evolutionary baseline that shaped our species over millions of years. Bisphosphonate medications can reduce bone loss rates, while growth hormone supplements can help maintain muscle mass, but these drugs address symptoms rather than underlying causes, while creating side effects and dependency issues that become problematic during multi-year treatment protocols required for permanent Mars residents. The complex interplay between gravitational adaptation and multiple physiological systems means that preventing one aspect of adaptation often exacerbates problems in other areas, while drug interactions and long-term toxicity effects create additional health risks that could be worse than the original adaptation process. Furthermore, pharmaceutical manufacturing and quality control on Mars would be extremely challenging, while supply chains from Earth would be unreliable and prohibitively expensive, making long-term pharmaceutical solutions impractical for permanent settlements, regardless of their theoretical effectiveness. Exercise countermeasures that work reasonably well for 6-month space station missions become inadequate when applied to multi-year Mars colonization, because the human cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems require constant gravitational loading to maintain Earth-normal function, while even the most intensive exercise regimens can only provide intermittent loading for a few hours per day. The Advanced Resistive Exercise Device and other sophisticated training equipment used on the International Space Station help slow bone and muscle loss, but cannot prevent the fundamental adaptations that occur when gravitational loading drops below critical thresholds, while the time and energy requirements for effective exercise protocols become burdensome when colonists must also perform essential survival tasks and equipment maintenance activities. Vibration platforms and other innovative exercise technologies show limited effectiveness for replicating the complex loading patterns that occur during normal Earth activities, while the psychological burden of spending several hours daily on exercise equipment becomes unsustainable over the years or decades required for permanent Mars residence. Genetic engineering approaches that might pre-adapt humans for Mars conditions raise profound ethical questions about consent and human identity, while the technical challenges of modifying complex traits like gravitational adaptation involve thousands of genes with intricate interaction networks that remain poorly understood despite decades of genetic research. Creating genetically modified humans optimized for Mars survival would essentially create a new subspecies before colonization even begins, while the irreversibility of genetic modifications means that such individuals could never return to normal human society even if Mars colonization efforts failed catastrophically. The fundamental barrier that defeats all technological solutions involves the reality that human biology represents the accumulated result of millions of years of evolution under very specific environmental conditions, while every cell and organ system carries embedded assumptions about gravitational loading and atmospheric composition and radiation levels that cannot be overridden through engineering interventions. The evolutionary programming that governs cellular metabolism and tissue development and organ function operates according to genetic instructions refined over countless generations, while attempts to maintain Earth-normal physiology in alien environments ultimately fail because they conflict with basic biological imperatives that prioritize adaptation and survival over maintaining compatibility with ancestral environmental conditions. What if the moment you step off the transport vessel onto Martian soil, you have unknowingly crossed a biological threshold from which there can be no return? The harsh reality facing long-term Mars residents involves the complete incompatibility of their adapted physiology with Earth's gravitational environment, because every beneficial adaptation that enhances survival on Mars simultaneously destroys the biological foundation necessary for surviving under full terrestrial gravity. The cardiovascular system undergoes such profound deconditioning during extended Mars residence that returning colonists would experience catastrophic circulatory failure when attempting to function in Earth's gravitational field, where blood pressure requirements exceed the pumping capacity of hearts that have spent years operating under reduced gravitational resistance. The left ventricle shrinks dramatically, while cardiac muscle fibers lose their contractile strength and efficiency, creating hearts that simply cannot generate sufficient pressure to maintain cerebral circulation against Earth's gravitational gradient, while baroreceptor sensitivity diminishes to the point where a normal blood pressure regulation becomes impossible. Orthostatic intolerance would develop to such extreme degrees that simply standing upright on Earth would cause immediate fainting while walking, or any physical activity would trigger dangerous drops in blood pressure that could result in stroke or cardiac arrest, as the weakened cardiovascular system fails to meet the sudden increase in circulatory demands. The autonomic nervous system that regulates heart rate and vascular tone would be completely unprepared for Earth gravity after years of calibrating itself to Mars conditions, while fluid regulation mechanisms would malfunction, causing dangerous swelling and electrolyte imbalances that compound the cardiovascular crisis. Skeletal integrity represents an even more catastrophic failure point, because bones adapted to Mars gravity would quite literally crumble under the mechanical stress of supporting full body weight in Earth's gravitational field, while the modified bone architecture optimized for reduced loading becomes structurally inadequate for terrestrial conditions. Compression fractures of vertebral bodies would occur immediately upon exposure to Earth gravity, while weight-bearing bones like the femur and tibia would snap under loads they were no longer designed to handle, creating multiple simultaneous fractures that would be impossible to treat effectively given the systemic nature of the skeletal deterioration. The hip joints and knees that evolved to support body weight against Earth gravity would fail catastrophically, as cartilage and ligament structures weakened by years of reduced loading prove unable to handle normal terrestrial stresses, while the pelvis itself might fracture under the simple act of standing or walking. Bone healing would be severely compromised because the cellular machinery responsible for bone formation would have adapted to Mars conditions, while calcium metabolism and vitamin D processing would be inappropriate for Earth requirements, making recovery from fractures slow or impossible. Vestibular dysfunction would create disabling balance and coordination problems that could persist indefinitely because the inner ear structures responsible for detecting gravitational orientation would have recalibrated themselves completely to Mars conditions, while the neural networks that process vestibular information would be wired for low-gravity spatial relationships. Severe vertigo and nausea would accompany any attempt to move in Earth gravity, while the inability to maintain balance would make walking dangerous or impossible, even if the skeletal and cardiovascular systems could somehow handle the increased gravitational stress. Hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness would be profoundly impaired as the brain struggles to reinterpret sensory information through neural pathways adapted for Mars conditions, while motion sickness and disorientation could become permanent features of daily existence for returned Mars colonists. Unlike astronauts returning from International Space Station missions who experience temporary deconditioning that can be reversed through intensive rehabilitation programs, the biological changes occurring during multi-year Mars residence appear to cross irreversibility thresholds that make normal Earth physiology impossible to restore, regardless of medical intervention or exercise therapy. The fundamental difference lies in the duration and nature of the gravitational adaptation, where short-term space missions create functional changes that can be reversed while extended. Mars colonization triggers structural modifications at the cellular and tissue level that become permanent features of the adapted physiology. Rehabilitation protocols that successfully restore Earth normal function after 6-month space missions would be completely inadequate for addressing the comprehensive physiological transformation that occurs during years of Mars adaptation, while the medical infrastructure and resources required for treating multiple, simultaneous organ system failures would exceed what any Earth-based facility could provide. The sobering conclusion that emerges from analyzing these irreversible adaptations involves recognizing that Mars colonization represents permanent exile rather than exploration, because every colonist who spends more than a certain critical period on Mars becomes biologically committed to remaining there for the rest of their lives, regardless of personal desires or changing circumstances that might make return to Earth desirable or necessary. How quickly does the biological countdown to permanent exile begin ticking once human feet touch Martian soil, and why does the point of no return arrive so much sooner than anyone anticipated? The transformation timeline unfolds with terrifying rapidity because human physiology begins adapting to Mars conditions within days of arrival, while the cumulative effects of these seemingly minor changes accelerate into irreversible modifications that cross critical thresholds much faster than mission planners ever imagined when designing rotation schedules and return protocols for early Mars expeditions. Within the first 6 months of Mars residence, colonists experience the initial wave of bone demineralization and muscle atrophy that mirrors the well-documented effects of microgravity exposure, but occurs under the additional stress of Mars atmospheric conditions and radiation exposure that compound the gravitational adaptation process while creating unique physiological challenges that have no terrestrial analogue for comparison or treatment development. Calcium begins leaching from weight-bearing bones at accelerated rates, while muscle fibers start converting from slow-twitch endurance types to fast-twitch power types, optimized for brief explosive movements in low gravity rather than sustained postural support against Earth gravitational loading. The cardiovascular system initiates its adaptation sequence as blood volume decreases and cardiac output requirements diminish, while arterial walls begin losing elasticity in response to reduced pressure, demands creating the foundation for more dramatic changes that follow in subsequent months. 12 months into Mars residence, the cardiovascular adaptation process accelerates dramatically as heart muscle mass decreases substantially, while stroke volume and cardiac output drop below levels capable of maintaining adequate circulation in Earth gravity conditions, while baroreceptor sensitivity diminishes to accommodate the altered hemodynamic requirements of low-gravity physiology. Blood vessel architecture begins remodeling with smaller diameter arteries and reduced capillary density as the circulatory system optimizes itself for pumping blood against reduced gravitational resistance, while red blood cell production decreases as oxygen transport demands diminish in the controlled atmospheric environments of Mars habitats. Hormonal regulation systems shift their baseline parameters as endocrine glands adapt to the altered metabolic and stress conditions of Mars existence, while sleep cycles and circadian rhythms begin synchronizing to the 24.6-hour Martian day, creating temporal desynchronization from Earth biological clocks that affects every aspect of physiological function. 18 months marks the emergence of pronounced spinal and vestibular modifications that begin crossing irreversibility thresholds as vertebral spacing increases and natural curvature patterns flatten, while intervertebral discs expand to accommodate reduced compressive loading, creating structural changes that would be incompatible with Earth gravitational stress. The inner ear undergoes comprehensive recalibration as otolith organs adjust their sensitivity to Mars gravity levels, while semicircular canal function adapts to the altered fluid dynamics created by reduced gravitational effects on endolymph movement, and vestibular processing networks in the brain rewire themselves to interpret balance and spatial orientation information according to Mars rather than Earth gravitational parameters. Muscle architecture reaches advanced stages of adaptation with significant losses in postural muscle mass, while contractile protein composition shifts toward fast twitch configurations that provide enhanced performance for Mars activities but become inadequate for supporting body weight against Earth gravity. 24 months represents the critical point of no return, where multiple physiological systems cross adaptation thresholds beyond which Earth gravity tolerance becomes impossible to restore through any known medical intervention or rehabilitation protocol. Skeletal modifications reach structural configurations that cannot support full body weight, while cardiovascular deconditioning progresses beyond the capacity for adequate Earth circulation, and vestibular adaptations create neural wiring patterns that would produce disabling dysfunction in Earth gravitational conditions. The accumulated effects of radiation exposure begin manifesting through cellular and genetic changes that compound the gravitational adaptations while creating additional barriers to successful readaptation to Earth conditions. Bone density loss reaches levels where compression fractures would be inevitable under Earth gravitational loading, while cardiac muscle weakness progresses to the point where maintaining consciousness in Earth gravity becomes impossible due to inadequate cerebral circulation. 36 months marks the completion of comprehensive physiological transformation, where Mars-adapted humans become completely optimized for their alien environment, while simultaneously becoming utterly incompatible with Earth conditions through every major organ system and regulatory mechanism. The nervous system completes its rewiring for Mars spatial relationships, while the musculoskeletal system achieves full structural adaptation for low-gravity locomotion, and the cardiovascular system finalizes its reconfiguration for reduced pressure circulation, creating beings that are perfectly adapted for Mars survival, but biologically incapable of returning to their ancestral home regardless of technological assistance or medical intervention. Why do the very organizations planning to send humans to Mars remain mysteriously silent about research that suggests those pioneers may never be able to return home? The uncomfortable truth lurking behind every glossy Mars colonization presentation involves scientific data and medical projections that paint a far more sobering picture than the optimistic narratives promoted in public forums, because space agencies and mission planners possess internal research indicating that permanent biological transformation represents not just a possibility, but an inevitable outcome for any extended Mars residence. The research gaps in our understanding of partial gravity effects stem partly from the inherent difficulty of conducting long-term studies on humans, while ethical constraints prevent deliberate exposure of volunteers to potentially irreversible physiological changes, but these limitations also reflect a subtle, institutional reluctance to pursue research questions whose answers might undermine public support for Mars exploration programs. Animal studies using centrifuge systems to simulate Mars gravity have produced disturbing results that remain buried in technical journals, while computer models projecting long-term human adaptation to reduced gravity environments generate conclusions that never appear in congressional testimony or public space policy discussions, because the implications threaten the fundamental assumptions underlying current Mars mission architectures. Internal NASA documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal extensive discussions about gravitational adaptation thresholds, while mission planning committees debate rotation schedules and crew selection criteria based on medical projections that acknowledge the possibility of irreversible changes without explicitly stating that conclusion in public communications. Current mission planning operates under carefully crafted assumptions that avoid confronting the permanent adaptation problem by designing short-term surface stays or rotating crew assignments that would theoretically prevent colonists from crossing irreversibility thresholds, but these plans rely on optimistic projections about adaptation timelines, while ignoring the logistical and economic realities that make frequent crew rotations prohibitively expensive and technically challenging. The 18-month minimum surface stay required by orbital mechanics gets extended to 36 months or longer when realistic mission constraints are considered, while backup plans for emergency evacuation become impossible if return vehicles malfunction or launch windows are missed due to equipment failures or medical emergencies that could strand colonists for additional years beyond their planned residence periods. Mission planners privately acknowledge that successful Mars colonization requires permanent settlement rather than temporary exploration, but they cannot publicly admit this reality without addressing the biological transformation consequences that make such permanence involuntary rather than voluntary for the colonists involved. Public relations departments at space agencies carefully manage information release to maintain enthusiasm for Mars exploration, while avoiding discussions that might generate controversy or opposition from medical ethics boards who would likely oppose missions involving irreversible human experimentation. Press releases emphasize technological achievements and scientific discoveries, while downplaying or completely omitting medical research, indicating that Mars residents would become biologically incompatible with Earth conditions, because such information would transform public perception of Mars colonization from heroic exploration into human sacrifice for dubious scientific gains. The narrative of brave pioneers choosing to make ultimate sacrifices for humanity's future becomes much less appealing when the sacrifice involves involuntary permanent exile rather than conscious martyrdom, while families of potential colonists would likely object to missions that amount to sending their loved ones into biological exile with no possibility of return visits or reunions. Medical ethics oversight committees struggle with informed consent protocols for Mars missions because existing bioethics frameworks provide no guidance for evaluating research proposals that involve irreversible transformation of human subjects, while the long-term nature of the changes makes it impossible to obtain truly informed consent, since volunteers cannot fully comprehend the implications of permanent biological exile from their home planet. Institutional review boards lack precedent for evaluating experiments where the primary endpoint involves fundamental alteration of human physiology, while the voluntary nature of consent becomes questionable when subjects cannot meaningfully understand the consequences of their participation due to the unprecedented nature of the biological changes involved. The conspiracy of silence that pervades space medicine discussions reflects institutional incentives that reward researchers who produce results, supporting Mars exploration goals while discouraging investigation of questions that might threaten mission funding or public support, regardless of their scientific merit or ethical importance. Conference presentations focus on technological solutions and countermeasures that might mitigate gravitational adaptation, while avoiding explicit acknowledgement that these interventions cannot prevent the fundamental biological transformation that occurs during extended Mars residence. Journal editors and peer reviewers tend to favor publications that frame Mars adaptation as a manageable challenge rather than an insurmountable barrier, while research funding flows preferentially toward projects that support, rather than question, the feasibility of human Mars exploration, creating systematic bias in the scientific literature that obscures the true magnitude of the permanent adaptation problem. What moral framework could possibly encompass decisions that fundamentally alter the evolutionary trajectory of our entire species and condemn future generations to permanent separation from their ancestral home? The ethical complexity surrounding Mars colonization transcends traditional biomedical ethics because the consequences extend far beyond individual participants to encompass fundamental questions about human identity and species continuity, while creating unprecedented moral dilemmas that existing philosophical and legal frameworks cannot adequately address. Informed consent becomes philosophically impossible when the true implications of Mars colonization involve biological transformation so profound that volunteers cannot meaningfully comprehend what they are agreeing to undergo because the human mind lacks the conceptual framework necessary to fully grasp permanent exile from Earth and gradual transformation into a different subspecies. Medical ethics requires that research subjects understand the risks and benefits of their participation, but Mars colonists face consequences that have no historical precedent, while the gradual nature of biological adaptation means that colonists might not recognize their transformation until they have already crossed irreversibility thresholds, making withdrawal of consent meaningless. The temporal disconnect between initial voluntary participation and ultimate involuntary consequences creates ethical paradoxes where colonists might enthusiastically consent to Mars missions while having no realistic understanding that they are simultaneously consenting to permanent biological exile and potential speciation events that will affect not just themselves, but all their descendants. Legal systems provide no precedent for evaluating contracts or agreements that involve permanent alteration of human biology, while the international nature of Mars missions complicates jurisdictional questions about which ethical standards apply when colonists from different nations undergo irreversible changes that were not fully understood at the time of departure. Children born on Mars face even more profound ethical violations because they experience permanent exile without any possibility of consent or choice, while their biological adaptation to Martian conditions occurs during development, when they have no legal capacity to understand or object to their circumstances. These Mars-born individuals become the ultimate victims of their parents' reproductive decisions because they inherit biological characteristics that forever prevent them from visiting the planet where their species evolved, while their cultural and genetic heritage becomes increasingly irrelevant to their daily survival needs. The rights of unborn generations become central ethical considerations because current colonization decisions create permanent consequences for people who have no voice in the choices being made on their behalf, while future Mars-born humans might reasonably argue that their forced adaptation to alien conditions represents a form of biological abuse committed by previous generations. International human rights frameworks provide no guidance for protecting the interests of people who will be born into permanent planetary exile, while existing concepts of nationality and citizenship become meaningless for individuals who are biologically incapable of visiting their theoretical home countries. Species preservation obligations raise fundamental questions about humanity's responsibility to maintain Earth-adapted human genetics as a form of biological heritage, while Mars colonization might represent an irreversible abandonment of evolutionary adaptations that took millions of years to develop through natural selection processes. Conservation biology principles suggest that maintaining genetic diversity across separated populations enhances species survival, but deliberate creation of reproductively isolated human subspecies might violate ethical principles about preserving natural human characteristics for future generations who might value their Earth-adapted heritage. Cultural continuity becomes increasingly problematic as Mars societies develop along completely different trajectories from Earth civilizations, while communication delays and environmental pressures create cultural evolution that gradually separates Martian humanity from terrestrial traditions and values that define human civilization. The preservation of literature and art and philosophical traditions becomes challenging when Mars-born individuals lack experiential understanding of Earth environments and social structures that inspired human cultural achievements, while their own cultural production reflects alien environmental influences that Earth humans cannot fully comprehend or appreciate. Legal and moral status questions surrounding Homo Martianus create unprecedented challenges for international law and human rights frameworks, because Mars-adapted humans might eventually become so biologically different from Earth humans that their classification as the same species becomes scientifically questionable, while their political and legal rights remain undefined. Future conflicts between Earth and Mars populations could involve disputes about resource allocation and political autonomy, while the biological differences between the populations complicate diplomatic relationships and treaty negotiations that might need to address fundamentally different physiological needs and environmental requirements. The possibility that Mars-adapted humans might develop cognitive or psychological characteristics different from Earth humans raises additional questions about moral responsibility and legal competency, while their unique evolutionary pressures might create ethical frameworks and value systems that Earth humans consider alien or incomprehensible, creating permanent barriers to meaningful moral dialogue between the separated populations. Are we collectively making the most profound decision in human evolutionary history without ever consciously choosing to do so, while sleepwalking toward a future where our species splits forever into separate branches that can never reunite? The terrifying reality surrounding Mars colonization involves the fact that humanity stands on the precipice of deliberately creating a new subspecies through technological means, while the vast majority of people remain completely unaware that this irreversible transformation represents an inevitable consequence of successful Mars settlement rather than a distant theoretical possibility. Politicians authorize funding for Mars missions while voters support space exploration initiatives, and scientists develop colonization technologies without anyone explicitly acknowledging that these seemingly progressive policies amount to choosing permanent human speciation over maintaining our evolutionary unity as a single terrestrial species. The decision unfolds through thousands of small bureaucratic choices and technical developments that individually appear harmless or even beneficial, while collectively steering our species toward biological fragmentation that cannot be reversed once the process begins. Corporate executives invest billions in spacecraft development, while university researchers publish papers on Mars agriculture, and government agencies sign international agreements for cooperative exploration missions. But none of these decision-makers frame their actions as votes in favor of splitting humanity into Earth-adapted and Mars-adapted subspecies, despite the fact that successful completion of their projects guarantees exactly that outcome. The timeline for this unconscious choice spans only the next 20 to 30 years, because current technological development trajectories suggest that permanent Mars settlements will become feasible within that time frame, while the biological adaptations that create irreversible speciation begin immediately upon colonist arrival, making the window for conscious reconsideration extremely narrow. SpaceX targets Mars landing capabilities by the early 2030s, while NASA plans sustained surface operations shortly thereafter, and other space agencies pursue similar timelines, meaning that the first permanent Mars colonists could begin their irreversible biological transformation before most people realize that human speciation has become inevitable rather than hypothetical. The accelerating pace of technological development leaves little time for democratic deliberation about the wisdom of permanent Mars settlement, while the competitive pressures between nations and corporations create incentives to proceed rapidly, rather than pause for careful consideration of long-term consequences that extend far beyond immediate mission objectives. Once Mars-adapted humans exist, the speciation process becomes irreversible regardless of later regrets or changing political priorities, because biological evolution cannot be undone through policy decisions or technological interventions, while the separated populations would continue diverging according to evolutionary pressures that operate independently of human intentions or preferences. Children born on Mars would carry genetic and physiological adaptations that permanently separate them from Earth humanity, while their own offspring would experience even more pronounced biological differences that accelerate the divergence process through successive generations until reproductive compatibility with Earth humans becomes impossible. The absence of meaningful democratic input into this species-altering decision reflects the technical complexity of space exploration that places critical choices in the hands of specialized experts, while the general public lacks sufficient understanding of biological adaptation processes to participate meaningfully in debates about long-term consequences of Mars colonization. Congressional hearings focus on budgets and technological milestones, rather than evolutionary implications, while public discussions about space exploration emphasize adventure and scientific discovery, without acknowledging that successful Mars colonies would create permanent biological exile for their inhabitants and irreversible speciation for humanity as a whole. International space law provides no framework for evaluating decisions that affect human evolutionary trajectory, while existing democratic institutions lack mechanisms for incorporating long-term biological consequences into policy-making processes that typically focus on immediate economic and political concerns rather than multi-generational species-level implications. The hidden question that nobody wants to confront directly involves whether humanity possesses the collective wisdom and moral authority to deliberately split our species into separate evolutionary branches, while the answer to that question will be determined through the accumulation of individual decisions made by relatively small numbers of people working in space agencies and aerospace corporations, rather than through conscious democratic choice by the global population whose evolutionary future hangs in the balance. Educational systems fail to prepare citizens for evaluating such profound choices, while media coverage of Mars exploration rarely mentions biological adaptation or speciation concerns, because these topics lack the immediate drama and excitement that capture public attention in our accelerated information environment, where long-term consequences receive minimal consideration compared to immediate technological achievements and competitive advantages. The ultimate irony involves the fact that humanity's greatest technological achievement could simultaneously represent our most catastrophic failure of collective decision-making, because we succeeded in reaching Mars while failing to consciously choose whether splitting our species represents progress or tragedy for the future of human civilization. What if our inability to solve the Mars adaptation problem actually reveals something magnificent about the fundamental nature of life itself and our place within the cosmic story of biological exploration? The seemingly insurmountable challenge of maintaining human biological integrity during Mars colonization reflects one of the most profound and beautiful aspects of living systems, because adaptation represents the core mechanism through which life has conquered every conceivable environment on Earth, from the crushing depths of oceanic trenches to the frozen peaks of Himalayan mountains, while transforming itself as necessary to match the requirements of survival in each new ecological niche. Biology operates according to principles that prioritize survival and reproduction over maintaining ancestral characteristics, because evolutionary success depends on the ability to modify form and function in response to environmental pressures rather than rigidly preserving original traits that might become liabilities in changed circumstances. The molecular machinery that governs cellular metabolism and tissue development and organ function carries within it an inherent flexibility that allows living systems to reorganize themselves when confronted with novel environmental challenges, while this same adaptability that enabled our ancestors to thrive across diverse terrestrial habitats now drives the inevitable transformation of Mars colonists into beings optimized for their alien world. The process unfolding on Mars represents nothing more than life doing what life has always done throughout its 4 billion-year history on Earth, where countless species have undergone dramatic evolutionary transformations when geographic isolation and environmental pressures created conditions favoring rapid speciation events. Evolutionary inevitability operates according to mathematical principles that make speciation unavoidable when populations become geographically separated while experiencing different environmental pressures, because genetic drift and natural selection working together over multiple generations will inevitably drive biological divergence regardless of human intentions or technological interventions designed to prevent such changes. The timeframe for speciation varies depending on generation length and selection pressure intensity, but the fundamental process remains consistent across all living systems, where isolated populations subjected to novel environmental challenges will always evolve along divergent pathways that eventually lead to reproductive isolation and the emergence of distinct species. Mars colonization simply provides another example of this universal biological pattern, where geographic separation combined with intense environmental pressure creates conditions that favor rapid evolutionary change, while the unique aspects of Martian environment accelerate the process through radiation exposure and gravitational adaptation that compound normal evolutionary forces. The price of expansion into new worlds has always involved transformation of the explorers, because biological systems cannot maintain perfect fidelity to ancestral forms while simultaneously adapting to completely different environmental conditions, and the history of life on Earth provides countless examples of species that underwent dramatic changes when colonizing new habitats. Marine mammals evolved from terrestrial ancestors through gradual adaptation to aquatic environments, while cave-dwelling species lost their vision and pigmentation through evolutionary responses to perpetual darkness, and Arctic animals developed specialized physiological adaptations for surviving extreme cold through metabolic modifications that distinguish them from their temperate zone relatives. The cosmic perspective on biological exploration suggests that life spreads throughout the universe not by maintaining unchanging forms across different worlds, but by allowing environmental pressures to sculpt new variations optimized for local conditions, while the diversity created through such adaptive radiation represents life's strategy for maximizing survival chances across unpredictable cosmic environments. Every planet that supports life would likely develop unique biological characteristics reflecting local environmental conditions, while interplanetary travel by any species would inevitably result in evolutionary divergence as travelers adapt to their new homes through the same fundamental processes that drive speciation events throughout the natural world. Human exceptionalism becomes questionable when we examine our biological responses to novel environments, because despite our technological sophistication and cultural complexity, we remain subject to the same evolutionary laws that govern all living systems, while our assumption that intelligence exempts us from natural selection reflects a misunderstanding of how evolution operates in complex organisms. Cultural evolution can modify the pace and direction of biological evolution, but cannot override the fundamental mechanisms that drive adaptation when environmental pressures exceed the buffering capacity of technology and social organization, while human physiology responds to Mars conditions according to the same principles that governed our ancestors' adaptation to terrestrial environments throughout evolutionary history. The beauty embedded within this biological reality involves recognizing that human expansion to Mars represents a continuation of life's ancient quest to explore and colonize every available habitat, while the transformations that occur during this process connect us to the fundamental forces that have shaped biological diversity since the earliest emergence of complex organisms on primordial Earth. Could there be something profoundly beautiful about discovering that our greatest technological ambition is ultimately constrained by forces more ancient and powerful than human engineering? The exquisite poetry embedded within our biological reality emerges when we recognize that every human body represents a 4 billion-year love letter written by Earth's gravitational embrace across countless generations of evolutionary refinement, where each heartbeat and breath and step reflects the planet's intimate shaping of our physiology through mechanisms so subtle and pervasive that we mistake them for universal constants rather than planetary-specific adaptations. Your bones carry within their crystalline matrix the precise mineral density required to support your weight against Earth's gravitational pull, while your muscle fibers contain contractile proteins arranged in configurations that optimize force production for terrestrial locomotion patterns, and your cardiovascular system operates according to pressure gradients, calibrated for pumping blood through vessels designed for one-gravity circulation. The calcium channels in your neurons respond to electrical potentials that evolved under Earth's magnetic field influence, while your circadian rhythms synchronize to the 24-hour rotation period that has governed biological timekeeping since the emergence of photosynthetic organisms that first learned to track solar cycles for metabolic optimization. Evolution operates as the universe's greatest artist because it sculpts living forms with infinite patience and precision, while responding to environmental pressures through creative solutions that transform simple chemical reactions into complex organisms capable of consciousness and wonder, and the ability to contemplate their own existence across cosmic distances that dwarf their physical dimensions. The sculptor's tools include random mutation and environmental pressure and genetic drift working together across millions of generations to carve biological masterpieces from the raw material of organic chemistry, while each species represents a unique artistic vision, expressing life's creative response to specific environmental challenges and opportunities. Mars colonists become unwilling participants in this ongoing artistic process as their bodies serve as clay being reshaped by alien environmental forces, while evolution continues its ancient work of matching form to function through biological modifications that optimize survival in conditions never before encountered by terrestrial life. The humbling truth that emerges from recognizing our place within this cosmic creative process involves understanding that human consciousness and technology represent nature's way of exploring itself rather than representing escape from natural laws and limitations, while our scientific achievements and engineering marvels simply extend evolution's reach into new realms rather than transcending evolutionary constraints. We are not separate observers studying nature from the outside, but rather expressions of nature's curiosity about its own possibilities, while our desire to explore Mars and transform ourselves in the process reflects the same exploratory drive that sent early mammals into new ecological niches and marine reptiles into oceanic environments, and ancestral primates down from forest canopies onto open savannas. The technological tools we create to reach Mars represent evolutionary adaptations expressed through cultural rather than biological mechanisms, while our spacecraft and life support systems and communication networks function as extended phenotypes that expand our environmental tolerance, just as beaver dams and bird nests and termite mounds extend the survival capabilities of their creators through environmental modification. Every cell in your body carries molecular signatures that connect you directly to Earth's geological history through isotopic ratios and trace elements that reflect the planetary chemistry from which life emerged, while your genetic code preserves information about evolutionary pathways stretching back through billions of years of terrestrial biological development. The hemoglobin molecules that carry oxygen through your bloodstream contain iron atoms forged in stellar cores and distributed by supernova explosions, while the carbon frameworks of your proteins and nucleic acids originated in ancient volcanic outgassing that created Earth's early atmosphere through geological processes that preceded life by hundreds of millions of years. Your nervous system operates using electrical potentials generated by ion gradients that depend on sodium and potassium concentrations, reflecting the salinity of primordial oceans, where life first learned to harness chemical energy for biological work, while your metabolic pathways preserve biochemical innovations developed by early prokaryotes that solved fundamental problems of energy capture and storage. The price of pursuing our deepest dreams and most ambitious explorations has always involved leaving something precious behind, because growth and transformation require abandoning familiar forms and comfortable limitations. While every evolutionary advance represents both gain and loss, as species trade ancestral characteristics for new capabilities. The tragedy and beauty of Mars colonization lies in recognizing that achieving our species' greatest technological dream requires sacrificing our biological connection to the world that created us, while simultaneously expressing the deepest essence of what makes us human through our willingness to transform ourselves for the sake of exploration and discovery. What would it mean to embrace the profound mystery of human transformation rather than desperately seeking technological solutions to biological realities that may be fundamentally unsolvable? The deepest wisdom emerging from our exploration of Mars adaptation involves recognizing that some challenges transcend the boundaries of engineering and exist not as problems requiring solutions, but as natural consequences of ambitious choices that reveal the true costs and benefits of pushing human civilization beyond its terrestrial origins. Acceptance of biological limits does not represent defeat or failure, but rather mature recognition that the universe operates according to principles larger than human preferences, while our attempts to override evolutionary constraints through technology may miss the more profound opportunity to participate consciously in the ongoing transformation that defines life's expansion into new environments. The beauty embedded within permanent commitment emerges when we consider that voluntary acceptance of irreversible exile from Earth might represent the ultimate expression of human courage and dedication to species survival, because Mars colonists would be choosing to sacrifice their personal connection to humanity's ancestral home for the larger goal of ensuring that human consciousness and culture persist beyond the vulnerabilities of single-planet existence. Such commitment transcends ordinary heroism because it involves not just risking death for noble causes, but accepting permanent transformation and separation from everything familiar, while trusting that future generations will find meaning and fulfillment in lives shaped by choices made before their birth by ancestors they may never fully understand or appreciate. The colonists who accept biological exile on Mars would be writing the opening chapters of a new branch of human civilization, while simultaneously closing the final chapter of their connection to terrestrial humanity through physiological changes that make return impossible regardless of technological advances or changing personal circumstances. Future generations will inherit the responsibility for determining what humanity becomes, as our species potentially divides into separate evolutionary branches, while the children and grandchildren of both Earth dwellers and Mars colonists will face choices about maintaining connections across interplanetary distances or allowing natural divergence to proceed according to environmental pressures and genetic drift. The ethical framework for these decisions remains undefined because no previous generation has faced choices with such profound long-term consequences for species identity and biological heritage, while traditional concepts of national identity and cultural continuity become inadequate when applied to permanently separated populations evolving along different trajectories. Mars-born humans will develop their own perspectives on these questions based on lived experience of conditions that Earth humans can only imagine, while their decisions about reproduction and cultural development and technological priorities will shape the future of human evolution in ways that current Earth-based policymakers cannot predict or control. Wonder preservation becomes essential because the universe continues to present mysteries that resist technological solutions, while maintaining our capacity for awe and curiosity in the face of unknowable complexity ensures that human consciousness retains its exploratory essence, regardless of the planetary environment where it develops. The questions surrounding Mars adaptation and human transformation connect to deeper mysteries about consciousness and identity and the nature of life itself, while our inability to engineer complete solutions to biological adaptation may protect us from the hubris of believing that technological mastery exempts us from participating in natural processes that govern all living systems. Scientific understanding illuminates mechanisms without eliminating mystery, because every answer generates new questions, while the complexity revealed through detailed study of biological adaptation and evolutionary processes increases rather than diminishes our sense of wonder at the intricate beauty embedded within natural systems. The meditation that concludes our exploration involves imagining that transformative moment when the first human child draws breath on Mars while existing entirely within artificial atmospheric systems, maintained by technology, but developing within biological frameworks sculpted by 4 billion years of terrestrial evolution, now encountering alien environmental conditions that will reshape every aspect of physiological development. That first breath of recycled air processed through mechanical systems and filtered through technological interventions represents both the triumph of human engineering and the beginning of biological transformation that will separate that child from the evolutionary heritage that enabled their existence, while connecting them to new, evolutionary possibilities that we cannot predict or fully comprehend. The recycled oxygen entering their lungs carries no trace of Earth's photosynthetic history, while their developing cardiovascular system begins adapting immediately to gravitational conditions that will optimize their physiology for Mars survival, rather than Earth compatibility. Every heartbeat pumps blood through vessels that will never experience full terrestrial gravity, while their bones mineralize according to loading patterns that prepare them for lifelong residence on an alien world where Earth represents only a bright star visible in the Martian sky. There will indeed be no going back, because that first breath initiates cascading biological changes that unfold according to evolutionary principles operating beyond human control, while establishing the foundation for whatever form of humanity emerges from the marriage between terrestrial genetics and Martian environmental pressures across generations of adaptation and selection that lie ahead in our species' uncertain but magnificent future.